Hi, everyone. There's still a couple of people still joining, but I thought we might as well get started. So welcome, everybody, to the Children and Young People Centre for Justice's webinar on Understanding and Challenging Justice Inequalities. My name's Alan Young. I'm a Policy and Public Affairs Advisor with CYCJ, and I'll be hosting this webinar. We've got two fantastic speakers for you today. We've got Lucien Forster, who's a Research and Policy Officer with the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. And he's going to be talking about CRER's recent findings about racial inequality and youth justice in Scotland. And he'll be followed by my CYCJ colleague, Julia Swann, who's a Participation, Engagement and Policy Advisor at CYCJ, and she'll be talking about the Challenging Justice Inequalities project that she's been working on with Kayleigh Charlton and others. So the structure for today, I'm going to pass over very shortly to our two presenters who are going to talk about their work, and then we're going to move straight into hearing your questions. Only the speakers and the organisers of the webinar will have their cameras and mics turned on. So if you have a question, then please put this in the chat and we'll try and answer as many as we can. Also, just to note that this webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded to CYCJ's website and also to our social media. But we do ask that all attendees do not use any other recording devices. So that's either video or audio, including those which are AI assisted. Okay, great. So now I'll pass over first to Lucien.
Cheers, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Give me just 2 moments to get my slides up. Can I just get confirmation that that's gone up okay? Okay, magic. Okay, yeah, great to see everyone today. My name is Lucien Forster. I'm a race equality researcher working with the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. We're a Scottish anti-racism charity that for over 25 years has been working to eliminate racial discrimination and promote racial justice in Scotland through research and kind of targeted policy interventions. So today I'll be speaking about some of CRER's work on youth justice in just a moment. So yeah, as I said, CRER is a Glasgow-based anti-racism charity, and I'm part of the research and policy team there, overseeing the research on housing, mental health, as well as the justice system. So today I'd really like to talk about a particular piece of work that we did, which was CRER's kind of first, proper research effort into themes about youth justice specifically. And this was part of a wider project called State of the Nation, which was a incredibly long, like 150-page report produced, which kind of brings together a lot of the key evidence that exists within Scotland to highlight some of the disparate inequalities and outcomes experienced by people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. We know that in Scotland, it can be sometimes difficult to advance conversations around racial justice, where there's a perception that racism is not as big of an issue as perhaps in England and Wales. And this report was created to not only challenge that notion, but also challenge the notion that we don't have evidence in Scotland, really trying to harness the point that it's not a lack of evidence that's preventing us addressing these inequalities, but it's a lack of targeted action. And over the course of today, I'm going to run through some of the evidence that we explored during that research. So State of the Nation looks at employment, it looks at housing, mental health, criminal justice, as well as community cohesion. And within the criminal justice section, we are looking at youth justice and ethnicity. So we know that children and young people in Scotland have quite a complex relationship with the justice system. But if we take an intersectional lens, we can recognise that children and young people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds have unique experience of this. This affects their experiences of policing, their experiences of detention, how they navigate the justice system, both on the youth justice side as well as the criminal justice side, as well as their visibility or invisibility within Scottish datasets. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, it might be useful for me to explain what I mean by an intersectional approach. So this is referring to the term coined by the African-American thinker Kimberly Crenshaw, which is used to describe the oppressive experiences faced by Black women in America, recognizing that their experiences of sexism were unique to the experiences of white women, but also their experiences of racism were unique to the experiences of Black men, recognizing that there's an intersecting system of oppression that generated unique experiences of inequality and discrimination as African-American women. Since Crenshaw first coined this term, her framework's been kind of used and adapted by a lot of other thinkers and have kind of recognized how it can be deployed in a number of other settings to help understand oppression, inequality, and discrimination. So when we're looking at youth justice, I'm specifically looking at ethnicity and looking at age and looking at how the unique combinations of these factors shape Black and minority ethnic children and young people's experiences of the justice system. So one of the ways that we can think about people's interactions with the police in Scotland is through the day-to-day interactions where they're upfront. So, well, interaction with the police, I guess. And one of the ways we looked at this was through stop and search data in Scotland. Stop and search's response, describe the scenario where a police officer can stop anyone they suspect within their kind of reasonable grounds to be potentially exhibiting criminality, and they can search their person to look into that. So when we looked at stop and search data, whilst we looked at this over the course of 5 years, I'm going to particularly highlight some of the most recent data to speak about this inequality. So we found that between April 2024 and June 2025, about 18,000 children and young people in Scotland were stopped and searched by the police, and with about 2,300 of these coming from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. What this meant was that BME groups made up a larger proportion of stopped and searched young people than they did adults. So these numbers are already quite sort of disproportionate to what we see in the population, but what we see is a particular issue among children and young people who are even greater than their expected rate, represented within the stop and search data set in Scotland. So yeah, it was 12.4% of stopped and searched children and young people in Scotland came from Black and minority ethnic groups. What we found is within that is this isn't an inequality that's experienced equally. Some ethnic groups are much more likely to be stopped and searched than others. And in particular, we found that people from African, Caribbean, and Black ethnic backgrounds are massively overrepresented within stop and search figures here in Scotland. So one of the ways that we can look at that is knowing that children from African, Caribbean, and Black ethnic backgrounds make up just 0.8% of the kind of young population in Scotland, so it's age adjusted. But within the stop and search data set, we saw that African, Caribbean, and Black groups make up 4.2% of stopped and searched young people, showing there's a real disproportionate representation within that. If we adjust these figures for their kind of representation, we see that's 2.5 times more likely than you would expect given their share of the population. So to kind of look at that, we can look at what kind of police perceptions of children and young people are, but we can also look at what police perceptions of Black and minority ethnic groups, particularly those from African, Caribbean, and Black ethnic backgrounds. And as much as we sometimes hear that this isn't an inequality in a Scottish context, something maybe you see with the Metropolitan Police in London, all of the data in Scotland shows that there's disproportionate representation of Black ethnic groups as being the subjects of stop and search. What we can also see in Scotland is the use of strip search being sort of disproportionately used on children and young people. So everyone may be familiar with the story of Child Q, which was a child who was kind of horrifically involved in a strip search without any of the proper safeguards down in England and Wales, which kind of gave rise to a much larger conversation about stop and search involving young people, children and young people. And prompted by that kind of atrocity happening in England, we decided to look at what the stats are saying in Scotland around this. And we found that there's huge disproportion about BME groups being subjected to strip searches much higher than the rates that we see for not only white, Scottish, British groups in Scotland, but also it's just in terms of those being stopped and searched in general. So we found that during the time period we've been looking at, there are 251 strip searches on those aged 15 to 24 in Scotland. Of that group, 24% are coming from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So what that means within the context of stop and searches, given that's about 12% of stop and searches being on a BME child and young person, is that 1 in 25 searches involved a strip search for BME groups, where it's 1 in 91 for those from a white Scottish background. To kind of expand on what exactly that means, a strip search is categorized as any type of search where clothing beyond a coat, a jacket, gloves, headwear, footwear, so outerwear is removed, and that's meant to either happen in a police station or that's meant to happen in a way sort of outside of the public eye. But that's something that we're seeing, that not all of those sort of rights and safeguards are necessarily being properly addressed, and there does seem to be an ethnicity component with which children are treated with have the most access to those safeguards being actually a lived reality of their experience of policing. So putting these numbers into context, it means that children from African, Caribbean and Black ethnic backgrounds are already on the harshest impact of stop and search in Scotland. They are 4 times as likely to experience a strip search in Scotland compared to their white Scottish British counterparts during that same type of policing interaction. When you look at the data in terms of whether items are found in these searches, there's no operational data to suggest that there's a greater need or there's some sort of intelligence-based kind of driver of that pattern. So it leaves us to ask, why are Black children specifically consistently suspected of either greater criminality or subjected to harsher, more invasive police actions within these interactions? And how does that then shape their experiences of policing, as well as their kind of trust and confidence in the service, which I'll come on to a little bit later. What we also explored within this research was BME children and young people's experiences of detention. So we know that there's been a real drive in the last 5-6 years, specifically in Scotland, to change how children and young people in conflict with the law experience that justice system, often leading to the removal of under 18s from Scottish prisons, but also trying to move towards a model based on kind of secure accommodation rooted in ideas more of sort of social care rather than just the full criminal justice system imprisoning children and young people. Is that seen as something that really impacts people's life chances and experiences more than it supports them towards a better lifestyle. So when we look at the data of what that's looking like, we find something really, really interesting, where currently, well, at least the most recent data from 2025 shows that 15.3% of under 21s in detention in Scotland come from BME backgrounds, meaning that's a greater proportion compared to their share of the national population. But what we also see is in this graph I've got here on the left, is that the number has been dropping steadily for white ethnic groups as part of this kind of movement towards getting people outside of prison-based kind of correctional facilities. But we don't see is that same pattern being realized for people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, whose numbers have not only stayed largely consistent in Scotland over this period, but have also in fact actually been the highest on record as they currently are. So as much as we're having these really important transitions within the youth justice sector, there seems to be a pattern of maybe BME children and young people being left behind. And again, we've got to ask questions about what are the specific outcomes and decisions being made for children and young people in these settings that mean that these particular rights are not being realized in the same way that they are for their white counterparts. What we also found is that there's a real issue in our ability to understand the specific drivers of justice system inequalities for children and young people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So when I speak about intersectionality, for example, part of what we look at, how to kind of understand what that means from an evidence-based perspective, or at least a statistical evidence-based perspective, is trying to see if we can disaggregate our data sets by multiple characteristics at once. For example, so we can see how the experiences of African, Caribbean and Black groups differ from those of white groups, as well as seeing how that would interact with age. And so we found that in Scotland, there's a real lack of intersectional data being available really at all, outside of the kind of key data sets with stop and search and representation in the Scottish Prison Services database, that with the data I've just been able to present. But what this essentially means is not having intersectional data really masks our ability to monitor the inequalities affecting Black and minority ethnic groups, well, particularly for children and young people. And it means we get a really patchy understanding of what the specific pathways are of a single, say, child's experience through the times they come into contact with the system and what that kind of means for them and the different opportunities for intervention that might arise from that. So to illustrate a point on that, one of the things I looked at was the use of police force in Scotland. So this describes any case where something like a baton or restraints or CS spray or tasers are kind of deployed in a police interaction. And we have data disaggregated by age, which shows that under 18s are 2.5 times as likely, or more likely to be subjected to the use of police force compared to adults. But then if we look at for people from African, Caribbean and Black backgrounds, so they're 72% more likely compared to white Scots. But we don't have access to is any data that allows us to see how these two factors influence one another and shape those unique experiences of children and young people from African, Caribbean and Black ethnic backgrounds. So given that we know that each kind of part of their identity is linked to an inequality, we really can't quantify at least the unique experience of that, prompting the need obviously for further research in terms of the statistics and improvements there, but also really harkening why we maybe need some lived experience research to actually understand that unique inequality. But I'll kind of come more into that side of things as well in just a moment. But essentially, without data in these sorts of contexts, it's really hard to accurately monitor the nature and extent of these problems. Even though all evidence suggests it likely is an inequality, we just can't put a number on it. So to kind of get towards the end of what we were starting to look at was the impacts of not having this evidence. Obviously, it reduces our ability to monitor things like the use of force, but we also found is it really impacts people's ability to, well, our ability to monitor how people navigate the system. So for example, I mentioned detention, and we have lots of data available on people when they're in, young offenders institutions, actually being processed as part of the Scottish Prison Services dataset. But we can't find, for example, is the number of BME children kept in police station custody or how long they're being detained for. We know from a couple of FOI examples, there's about 2 that have been launched in Scotland, that but only within Glasgow, we see that inequalities do exist, but we don't have a large enough sample to really be able to understand what that looks like. And the data is collected, but it's not being deployed in a way that we can actually have that transparency and have that public accountability about children and young people's experiences there. Similarly to this, we also can't track the ethnicity of children being referred to the children's hearing system in Scotland. Again, since about 2020, there's been the kind of effort to start collecting this data, but 6 years down the line, we don't see any of it publicly released. And what it means is we don't see any of the potential inequalities of where the potential different rights of children are being realized. And given that we've got those inequalities within the young offenders institutions, it'd be really interesting to then kind of see what are the contributory factors leading into that inequality. But currently, we just do not have the data to be able to look at that. So why this is really important is that data is essential for trust and confidence, accountability, all of the kind of values that are really critical to our idea of policing by consent, which we really try and enshrine here within Scotland. And I thought it'd be interesting to kind of use a couple of quotes, one from Kimberly Crenshaw herself, the woman who coined the term intersectionality. And she said, if you can't see a problem, you can't solve it. And I recently attended a talk down in London by a guy called Dr. Celestin Okoroji, and his research is looking at ethnicity data in lots of different circumstances in the UK. And he said last week that data is the friend of systems change. And I thought I could put those 2 ideas almost in conversation here just to show by not having access to statistical evidence like this in Scotland, we can't measure the problems that we know of that we're facing. And without being able to monitor what the nature and extent of those problems, it's really difficult to sort of target interventions against them. And then even if we do, it's really difficult to target to measure whether they actually work and whether they're being representative of the kind of changes that we'd like to make in our society. So bringing this all to a close, it's important to ask what can we essentially do to start challenging some of these inequalities, as we have pockets of data to understand what some of these inequalities might look like, but there's a really long way we've got to go. So one thing that we could do is just recognize that inequalities thrive when we render them invisible and easy to ignore. Part of that package is improving the availability and quality of Scottish data. That means working with partners in academia, but as well as within policing, to ensure that publicly available data is available to promote transparency and to promote accountability, as well as just being able to monitor what works to address these inequalities and whether they're being addressed by the policy changes we're already implementing in Scotland. But it's not all about statistics. Stat can tell you essentially whatever you'd like it to tell you to in a lot of circumstances. So it's really important that we use lived experience to really ground the experience, well, what we see within statistics to the actual lived outcomes of people on the receiving end of these experiences. And that's something that whether it's the meaningful involvement in decision-making, co-production of design and services. Valuing people's lived experience gives us an ability to measure a problem far beyond just whether a stat suggests there's an inequality, but we have a real problem where lived experience is treated as anecdotal. So it's really about having the two types of evidence in conversation with each other, showing that lived experience really allows you to get to the detail of a problem, but the stats allow us to tell us that that lived experience is representative of system-based inequalities that we see in Scotland, whether due to things like institutional racism or the kind of wider impact of structural racism. It's really important then, recognizing that racism is such a key driver within this space, that our approaches to youth justice are necessarily person-focused in a way that recognizes the complex identities that shape the way people navigate systems. So that means we have to take an anti-racist approach, recognizing the impacts of structural and institutional racism and shaping people's experiences and how they may come into conflict with the justice system in the first place, but also their treatment within it, recognizing there'll be many opportunities where a decision has been made with a racist bias to it that shapes people's outcomes and their whole experience of this system. And in order to do that in a youth justice setting, we need to embrace intersectionality for all of the reasons I've mentioned so far, but also recognizing that then the experiences, say, women from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds who are young as well, they'll experience even further compounding inequalities within this setting, as well as people who are, say, neurodivergent or people who are disabled in other ways, where they will experience their own unique circumstances of this inequalities. And until we can measure that within our systems, it's really, really difficult to be able to name the problem, let alone being able to do something about it. So I'm running slightly over, so just bringing this all to a close. Data is obviously only part of the challenge, but it allows us to use evidence in designing and delivering and evaluating the policies that we've got in Scotland. Without data, we would not necessarily know that the change towards a more kind of social care-based youth justice system isn't being realized in the same way for people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, and data is a really important tool to be able to use within that setting. So CRER is using this data to kind of inform targeted campaigning, targeted policy development work, as well as to show the need for further research where we don't know what we don't know because of data gaps. But we all have a duty to challenge racism. So my ask coming out today is, what will you do in your own space, in your own work, to recognize how we can realize some of these inequalities, name them, and then begin addressing them in all the ways they manifest in the work that we do. So with that, thank you so much for listening. I look forward to answering your questions as they come. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucien. That was great. Really powerful research from CRER. And now I'm just going to hand over to Julia Swann, but just before I do, just to remind people that please pop your questions in the chat for the presenters, and we'll come to them after Julia's presentation. Julia.
Let me get my slides on the go. Is that all good? Yeah.
Yep.
Okie dokie. Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, so thank you, Alan, for hosting and for the introduction, and thank you, Lucien, for that presentation. I know that the State of the Nation report has been incredibly helpful for us. You know, we've been aware that there has been this gap, and we know from our experience and what we see that there are these issues, but we don't have anything to kind of back that up. So to have something finally that we can actually refer to in policy recommendations is massively helpful. So thank you, and it was great to hear more about it. So I'm Julia Swann. So I'm a participation, engagement and policy advisor at CYCJ. So I'm just going to talk you through one of the projects that we are working on at CYCJ, predominantly in the research team, and it is Challenging Justice Inequalities. And so I'll kind of give you a bit of background on the project and some of the context of where we are just now with it. So to start off, I just want to kind of take a bit of a pause to set the scene slightly. So I think when we kind of attempt to challenge inequality in any way, we have to kind of start with this foundation of honesty about power relations and the power that we all hold in various ways. So I just want to be transparent about where I fit in here and how that is relevant to the work on this project and work more broadly as well. So I joined CYCJ about 5 years ago. So I'm fairly comfortable in the work that I do. My work always focuses on participation and influencing policy and practice with children and young people who have various levels of lived experience of justice systems. And a lot of that work for me has a focus on secure care. I came into the role with a background in social policy and psychology, and I also come in with my own lived experience, and I've put that in inverted commas because I think sometimes the term can kind of be used without any real indication of the meaning or the weight behind it. So in my experience, what I mean by this is that I've experienced various elements of areas that I now work in and work to change. But this isn't actually required for the role that I do, and I don't actually often involve it in my role, but it does serve as a bit of a sort of point of empathy, I think, in a lot of ways. In terms of relevance to the project as well, I identify as queer. I'm a white woman. I'm multiply neurodivergent and from a middle class background. All of these things can really kind of influence the balance of power in different settings. And I know that these will have impacted the project and the relationships that I have developed with our co-researchers, and through that, the direction of the research as well. But I quite like to encourage and also model this kind of open reflexivity in the practice that we do, and also just to kind of model the fact that participatory methods really should be a mutual exchange. So part of my role involves creating an environment of trust with children and young people, and I like that trust to be mutual. So I like to share the context of where I've come from as well. So a bit more about challenging justice inequalities. So the project kind of started out 2 years ago with funding from the Nuffield Foundation to develop this kind of partnership between University of Strathclyde, CELCIS and the research team here at CYCJ. So we have the project team and then an interdisciplinary advisory group, which is a kind of wider network of various professionals and academics who kind of oversee and have a bit of guidance towards the direction of things. We really set out to explore children's justice experiences, and specifically through an intersectional lens, which I'll speak a bit more about later on. So I suppose we kind of started out with this point that we were at where we know certain things. There's what we know, which is that there are these multiple overlapping disadvantages that children and young people who are more likely to be involved in justice systems experience, and we know that and we see that. But what we don't know is this kind of the evidence of how these disadvantages actually intersect and compound one another. So as Lucien highlighted, there is kind of little evidence of the impact of like all these different disadvantages and how they interact with one another. And I think also, particularly within Scotland, there's a tendency for children and young people in conflict with the law or in justice systems to be viewed as this homogenous group. I think there's often this perception that when we think about youth justice in Scotland, we think about straight, white, working class boys. And sometimes this can be used to kind of justify not directly addressing racial inequality, for example, in youth justice, because it's seen as, if this area is predominantly straight, white, working class boys, then maybe we're just wasting our time focusing on this one specific area. But I think, this kind of lack of knowledge, it tends to perpetuate itself, really. We can't address the things that we don't know about, and it's part of our duty to develop our knowledge on these issues and also to just kind of acknowledge that regardless of you know, the makeup of the demographic of children that are involved in justice systems, if there was one child who didn't fit into that group, then that doesn't negate their rights or their needs. If anything, it amplifies them because they're even more marginalised within a system. So that's kind of where we wanted to start developing some evidence around. So just to quickly introduce to the project team, so myself and my colleague Dr. Kaylee Charlton have worked closely with the co-researchers, which I'll explain in a moment. And then we have a team across Strathclyde University and CELCIS as well. And so lots of different perspectives coming together to make up this project. So to go a bit further into the kind of approach that we've taken, so we've started with this phased approach where we started out with focus groups essentially. So we knew that we wanted to form this youth advisory group. We started out by having these pretty broad focus groups with children in various youth groups, different areas of the country, some who are in custodial or secure settings, to kind of get their views of the concept of protected characteristics and how identity and protected characteristics kind of might interact with their experience of the justice system. From these sessions, we then kind of brought together a group of young people who were particularly interested in continuing to be involved in the work that we were doing. So we brought together 10 young people who were aged between 14 and 17, who all have various levels of experience of justice systems and other kind of areas of marginalisation as well on top of that. They are referred to as the Youth Advisory Group, and our intention was to kind of allow them to come up with a terminology that they felt most suited them, and they decided on they wanted to be referred to as the YAG. And over time we've developed I mean, we've been working together as a group for quite a while now, and we've developed all these kind of little inside jokes, and one of them is that YAG is actually the name of this little fidget toy, which is why I've included these little fidget toys who will live on forever in our minds. But this little fidget toy now represents the collective group. So we've worked with the group to kind of introduce them to research methods and how to approach research, and different methodologies and ways of analysing data as well. And the group have really really formed every way that the project looks currently. We explored different ideas of how identity and protected characteristics can impact experiences of justice, and we decided on this kind of final sort of research question of like doing intersectionality in justice. So the actual kind of action of I suppose operating a justice system in an intersectional way. So exploring intersectional experiences of policing with children and frontline police officers in Scotland. So this is one of the things that the YAG were very keen on, was to kind of have this part of the research was about young people and children with lived experience of these issues, but then also as part of the research process, including frontline police officers in this. So having this kind of data collection phase where we're meeting with children and finding out their views and their experiences, and then a sort of secondary part of that is meeting with officers from Police Scotland to explore their reflections on these. So it's a really interesting approach that they've come up with, and it involves a real mix of creative methods, focus groups and interviews that are all kind of all sort of interspersed with one another in various ways, and it's creating this really, really rich and often like very, very visually rich data as well. So to go into a wee bit more detail about the methodology of this, when we're actually carrying out the research, as one of the YAG members has put it, we want to find out how young people's different identities affect their contact with police in Scotland, and how police respond to and understand these experiences. So again, we've got this kind of these kind of two parts of the research question: what are children actually experiencing, and then are police aware of this? Do they know about it? Do they understand it? Do they have any feelings about it? One of the methodologies that we introduced the group to was a creative methodology, which you might be aware of, which is zines. This is something that I'm very interested in, and I'm involved in various ways in my work and my personal life, but it's essentially kind of DIY collage, writing, artwork that is self-published. It's traditionally quite a sort of politically active format, and some of the young people were familiar with it. They had tried this out in different groups and were very keen on it, and so this was part of the methodology that was chosen, was to actually within the focus groups with children create zines as well. So, and then analyse the zines as well as the conversations. This also means that then Police Scotland officers that are involved in interviews are sitting down and reading zines that children have made, which I also just think is really cool. I just think it's a really cool thing to be involved in. There's a couple of pictures here just as examples of the type of work that we've been doing. So how do you actually measure and analyse this kind of data with intersectionality in mind? So as Lucien pointed out, it's a very difficult thing to kind of pin down, you know, even with quantitative data, to try and kind of figure out how one set of data influences another and how these things interact. It's not really something that's very easily recorded or is tangible. It's not even something that's very easily defined, and perhaps even more so in qualitative data, because identity is so complex. Sometimes identity isn't visible. Sometimes you can hide it. Sometimes you can't hide it. That's an important thing to consider. Sometimes identity is quite contextual as well. So there's this this kind of theory of code switching, which is originally a sort of linguistic term relating to how people from different racial backgrounds can kind of change their language and their form of communication depending on the situations that they're in. So identity can be very contextual in that way. And it's something that all people do, but I think particularly, certainly in my own experience as someone who kind of fits into multiple marginalised groups, I know that I do it. I know that I code switch and I'm very aware of it. So how do you measure something? How do you even pin that down? Identity can also be really fluid and changeable, and I think this is particularly important to consider in the context of research with children and young people. Who we are or who we think we are when we're kids and when we're teenagers can be so far from who we develop into, and it's kind of I think being mindful of that, being mindful of how changeable identity can be as a young person, and also how changeable the importance that you place on that can be. And to quote Kimberly Crenshaw here from her original paper, actually, that kind of introduced the concept of intersectionality, it's that the intersectional experience is greater than the sum. So it's, I suppose, in a way, kind of similar to like Gestalt theory in psychology, that the world and experiences of the world are more than just these little sort of constituent parts, and we need to look at things holistically. And I think that intersectionality, one of the difficulties with it in terms of kind of measuring and analysing with an intersectional lens is that intersectionality is often misunderstood or misrepresented. Sometimes it's kind of used interchangeably just to mean diversity, which is kind of a misrepresentation of the concept. But it can be understood as a framework for understanding how these different points of marginalisation or oppression interact with one another. And as I've mentioned, often these have compounding effects. So what we're doing really within the project is we're viewing experiences of policing through this lens. So we're seeing all these different points of marginalisation within children's experiences, and seeing where and if and how they all interact with this experience of policing. And we're also looking to explore how police officers actually understand intersectionality, and whether this understanding impacts practice, and that can be practice on an individual level, or on an institutional level as well. So just quickly to kind of go over a couple of things that we've kind of got to so far. So we're at the point now where we have this kind of first data set of the work that we've done with children, and we're at the point now of working with frontline police officers to kind of include them in the research and this sort of secondary part of it. Some of the kind of themes that have come out so far, we're seeing this idea, really a sort of overarching theme of this concept of division and opposition. So all these kind of this kind of polar opposites keep coming up all the time. So this concept of comfort and discomfort, early childhood and adolescence, like how opposing they feel when you are a young person. The idea of fear and safety, the police as an institution that is scary and to be feared and is a danger to you, but then also an institution that you should rely on when you're in danger, and that kind of juxtaposition. I've included these images because I think one of the sort of juxtaposing images that has kept coming up and has really stood out for us is the idea of images of policing when you're a very young child. So you get these things like this, like little Lego police bike, and we had a lot of Paw Patrol, things like that, like the little police dog from Paw Patrol, and they were completely juxtaposed with these images of quite scary images that were cut out from newspapers of images of active policing on streets, and it was just this like vast divide between these two impressions, and like how do you get from one to the other? We're trying to figure all that out currently. So I'll just briefly kind of go over kind of where we want to get to, hopefully, with this. One of the young people who is involved in the YAG has written an incredible blog, which is on the website, which you'll have the link to at some point if you want to go and read it. But they've said, I hope to see this project grow into an important piece of research that shows decision makers that changes that need to be made on an institutional level in order to restore the trust and faith that young people have in the justice system. And I think that really nicely kind of encapsulates what we hope as well. Eventually, throughout the rest of this year, there will be published reports. We'll have a mix of co-produced reports with the young people and visual outputs as well that they're going to be creatively involved in. And we hope that down the line, this kind of can link in with the sort of policy influencing and practice influencing work that we do across CYCJ and the university and CELCIS. So if you want to just keep up to date with the project, there's a website and an email address specific to the projects. And if you have any questions or queries more generally about participation work at CYCJ, my email is there too. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. That was great. Yeah, so we've added a lot of the links that was mentioned by Julia and Lucien into the chat as well. And we'll also be sending around the slides after this webinar as well. So we've got just over 10 minutes to go through your questions. So I'm just going to work my way through what we have in the chat. So first of all, there was actually a comment, not a question, from Sherilyn Peck, who was mentioning the importance of Darren McGarvey's work, the trauma industrial complex, but his comments on lived experience. I'm sure many of us are familiar with him and his work. And then the next question is, will there be learning that can be taken from the more disaggregated data that will hopefully come out of how hate crime data is now being recorded and reported in the next few years? Because I know, especially Lucien, you touched on the real lack of data and how important data is really, for policing by consent and public understanding and accountability and everything like that. So that question's from Sarah Robinson Galloway. And Lucien, do you want to maybe answer that?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question, Sarah. That's really good question. So yeah, as much as in youth justice specifically, there's a lot of really patchy data that limits our understanding. But what we do know is that hate crime data is becoming increasingly well reported, with a couple of caveats, in Scotland. And actually the next piece of research I'll hopefully have published very soon is an analysis of the hate crime data from the most recent annual release of it, which is the first time we've got data from the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act, which came into force about 2022, but it's the first time we've actually got data of that new act being in force. And to just share a preliminary finding from that, we know that 18% of race hate crimes have a target who's under the age of 24. So we know that is a significant issue with hate crime. But what we also know is that underreporting is a massive, massive issue. And I think there are additional barriers for children and young people to actually report their own experiences of hate crime. And as much as we can record data once it's been reported to the police and log through their system, what we don't have is information about all of the children and young people's experiences who maybe do not feel comfortable and confident with reporting their experience for all of the sorts of reasons that Julia's outlined in her presentation, as well as my own. So that's something where we don't have data, but it's something we absolutely need to look at. And all you have to do is look at, the experiences of children facing racism and bullying in schools and things like that to understand that hate crime among young people is a massive, massive issue. But the data will come, and stay tuned to this area, because we've got something hopefully coming out in a matter of weeks with the latest analysis of that.
Great, thanks, Lucien. And Julia, I wondered if you had any comments maybe about, I don't know, maybe some of the experiences of the people you've worked with in secure care, or any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty is, for a lot of the work that we do, is to having the quantitative data to back it up. Obviously across the participation and engagement team at CYCJ, we do a lot of engagement with children and young people who have come into conflict with the law in various ways, and we can see from the work that we do, we can see that these are real issues. We can see that there are inequalities in various aspects of the experiences of children in the justice system, in situations where they're deprived of their liberty, even for short periods of time. We know that these aren't being experienced in a uniform way, and we know that in a lot of cases these aren't being experienced in the way that is the minimum standard for how that situation should be experienced. I suppose one thing that we have tried to do to address this, or to start addressing it, is to incorporate a focus on identity and diversity in all of the work that we do. And we've recently done kind of a bit of work within our organisation to make sure that a focus on diversity and equality is embedded in all parts of the work that we do. And we hope that by doing that, we'll be able to have kind of a more diverse range of work that we're doing, but also our position is very helpful because of the work that we do with Scottish Government and with a lot of organisations that deliver these kind of services to children and young people. That we can kind of, I suppose, just advocate for even just the collection of this data. We can advocate for the importance of it and why it needs to be collected and why it needs to be reported on. So yeah, a slow process, but we're hopefully doing some of what we can.
Thanks very much, Julia. And yeah, Sarah's come back with a comment and a question as well, but yeah, about how much information is being shared through Fearless, which is specifically for young people to report crime. So thanks for that, Sarah. Just to note, Lucien, there was a report shared by Jen, the CRER report as well.
Yeah, I saw that. I just want to reassure that is something that we'd come across as part of the research with State of the Nation and as part of the Youth Justice chapter. But to kind of echo one of that report's findings, it's just that the data is so patchy that they felt themselves as researchers that they couldn't reliably estimate the representation of children and young people from BME backgrounds in the system. So we know that there's a lot of data from England and Wales, and I can't remember exactly when this report came out. I think it's maybe 2018. So, people have been offering these reflections for many, many years now, but we're not yet seeing the improvements to our systems to be able to monitor these inequalities effectively. But thanks for sharing, and speaks to the particularly lived experience side a lot more, where it explores some of the qualitative evidence around the theme, which, whilst my work was slightly more focused on the statistical side. So hopefully they pair together quite nicely.
Thank you. And yeah, and just on that as well, there's a comment from Kirsty, who works at CRER, her and her colleague Judy Warburton, who was on one of our webinars very recently, talking about some of the ongoing work which they're doing, and would like to connect with you both on that. So we've got a couple more questions. I might just ask them both at the same time, although they are quite separate and just conscious of time. So the first one is, are you finding where young people are insecure that local authorities are putting needs of them first or more focused on finances? I might put that one to you, Julia. And the second question is, are the wider rises in far-right opinions, the general societal dismissal of experience in youngsters with certain racial profiles, being taken into account when looking at willingness to report these experiences? And is there any work looking specifically at Islamophobia too? Julia, I might come to you first about the secure care question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I suppose we're in a kind of period of a bit of flux around secure care. So the future of secure care consultation that the Scottish Government opened has just closed, and CYCJ were involved in the Reimagining Secure Care project 2 years ago now. I feel that, yeah, it's all a blur, which I was quite heavily involved in as well. So we're in this period of a lot of legislative change, and part of that change involves the structuring and the financing. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future is going to look like. But in terms of the needs of children in secure care, there are frameworks around this. There's the Secure Care Pathway and Standards, which was developed with children and young people who had been in secure care, and that kind of sets out the standard of care that should be provided. I think, I mean, in terms of the balance between needs and finances, that's far beyond my knowledge and experience. But speaking to the work that I'm involved in secure care. I know that children's experiences of secure care are massively diverse and complex, and yeah, there's no one experience of it. So yeah, I mean, I unfortunately can't speak to kind of the local authorities' approach to it, but there are standards in place to have, like, you know, a level of uniformity of what's provided.
Great, thanks, Julia. And now, Lucien, I wonder if you could answer Uzma's question about the rise in far right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, in terms of the influence of things like far right opinions, kind of the general state of community cohesion, as well as racial profiling in this country, absolutely all of this, I think, has an influence on people's trust and confidence in interacting with the police. Whilst there has not been loads and loads of research that specifically speaks on these themes, what we do know is, for example, is back during the kind of uprisings and riots that happened in London following the death of Mark Duggan at the hands of the Metropolitan Police Service, CRER had commissioned some research among young Muslim men in Glasgow and their experiences of over-policing. Whilst that was now, gosh, like 15 years ago almost, that was something that did specifically try and look at the experiences of Islamophobia and how they influenced people's trust and confidence in the police. But if we kind of look at the more recent trends, what we know that the effects of, say, disproportionate stop and search will undermine people's trust and confidence in the police, as they would not feel that their best interests are kind of being met, and be less likely to kind of report their own experiences of crime if they do not feel like they'll be treated sort of fairly or with the compassion that they are hoping to during an interaction like that. But what we can also see to kind of complicate this any further is, obviously there's lots of really positive commitments being made on paper. Often the rhetoric in Scotland is quite progressive regarding youth justice, but we also then see is, on the other hand, something like live facial recognition being a conversation that's coming up, an issue which we know not only is less effective at identifying children and young people in general, but it's also massively disproportionate at correctly identifying people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, with some models being over 100 times less accurate at identifying BME groups. So it's quite difficult, I think, when people want to have their own interests protected by the police, but then they feel like their police are maybe taking actions that might not be serving their own best interest, and that undermines their ability to feel confident that if they were to report an experience of hate crime, for example, that would be received with the care and sensitivity that's needed. So I hope that can kind of speak to some of your questions. I know that research on following Mark Duggan's death, I mentioned that's one of the references in State of the Nation, so you can explore that and some other themes if you look at the full report I've been speaking about. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Lucien. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid, everyone. I hope you found that webinar useful and interesting. Thanks so much, Julia and Lucien. That was great. Really powerful pieces of work that you're doing. I'm going to send round the slides, and we've posted a lot of the links in the chat, but please contact us by email if you'd like any more information.